Good morning, Halifax Forum friends. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel, Victory in Ukraine equals Climate Cooperation. I'm your moderator for the panel. My name is Mercedes Stephenson. I am the Ottawa Bureau Chief for Global News. I cover primarily politics and national security for our network. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to discuss this with our panelists today who have such fascinating perspectives that they're able to bring to a very important and complicated topic. I'm going to keep the bios brief because I suspect you know who these people are. They're all very high profile, so we can get to the discussion. But just to remind everyone, we have Jim Landon. He is the president of ATCO Frontec. We have Mike Savage, who is, of course, the mayor of Halifax. Thank you for having us to your lovely city, Mayor.
Great to have you all.
And we have Madeleine Redfern, who is the COO of CanArctic Inuit Networks and just a real leader in Canadian society as well. I'll be honest that when I first saw the title of this panel, I had to really think about what it means, because when I'm at the Halifax Forum, I'm thinking a lot about conflict. I'm thinking about peace. I'm thinking about security. I'm not always thinking about climate change. And then I saw Wayne Eyre, our Chief of the Defence Staff, and I thought, if you want to know about climate change, ask General Eyre how the past year has been for the Canadian Armed Forces, how they've had to respond to fires and floods. Ask the Mayor of Halifax what it's been like to be in this province, which has suffered extensively through disaster after disaster. I thought about being in Ukraine and the way that the landscape was changing in front of you every day as a result of the war. And then I thought about the evacuations of the fires and floods that we had seen around the world, of the natural disasters. And in Canada, we're very fortunate that there's a lot of space for people to move, even if it's difficult to move them and we need the military to do it. But in other parts of the world, it's not so simple. And resources and rising water and less land and having to flee these disasters could lead to incredible conflict at a rate that we are not anticipating. And sometimes I think we think maybe we'll get a break. Like you saw in that video, there's a war in Ukraine. Maybe everything else will slow down. But what's happening with our climate is not slowing down. It's accelerating it and it's exacerbating it. And so that's what I'm hoping we can start to talk about today. Madeleine, I'd like to start with you because you reside in the Arctic. You are seeing the profound implications of this every day and the security implications as many countries have an interest in our Arctic and are present there. Do you want to start us off with what your thoughts are on how climate change is affecting international conflict and our security?
So thank you for that introduction and those opening remarks, because that's very much on point. I live in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, and like Mayor Savage, I actually was a former mayor, and I learned very quickly that I had to deal with a lot more issues than I expected, more than just, keeping the roads clear, some loose dogs, and the problems with the dump going on fire. It actually also meant that I had to deal with the small S security issues, everything from, fact that many of my people are food insecure and live in overcrowded housing, but also everything from the cost of energy, which is 100% diesel. And the fact that many of our communities have power plants that are beyond their age and at risk of actually being lost. And the issue of water security and having, contaminated water, and thankfully the military coming up and supporting us. And so we need to be able to address all these different types of issues, which are, some of it is from the result of climate change. We're seeing the warming of our environment, which means that the permafrost is melting, where our pipes are buried, and it's no longer like, solid concrete, and they break and they burst and they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix, to the invasion of Ukraine, where the fuel prices have gone up and exacerbated the cost of living. So it turns out, as was pointed out, there is such an intersectionality of these issues, and way more complicated and complex than I had realized. And we're having to deal with this in real time. And so I've also learned that industry has an immense role to play in determining or supporting the innovation to be able to address climate change issues and security issues, and that we need to see the investments in the Arctic that are climate change proof, but also good for our economy so that we can be prosperous, but also that is good for defense and security, you know, at the community level, but also at the national level.
Jim, I want to go to you next because of that mention of energy security, which came into such sharp focus for all of us with Ukraine. And it went from just a discussion about the environment and energy to the environment, security, and energy. And I know that that's something you deal with every day in your job.
Yes, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say I'm a poor substitute for my boss, Nancy Southern, who was a previous recipient of the Builder Award here. She unfortunately couldn't make it this weekend, so I get the chance to try and fill her very elegant shoes. It seems to me that there is a real tension between these competing priorities that Madeleine talked about, where you want energy security, but you also want to tackle climate change. And you want energy security and you want to tackle climate change today, but are these things actually pragmatically and economically possible at the speed at which we'd like to do them? And we've seen, I think, with the Ukraine war, just how important energy is to a country that is trying to fight for its own survival. The Russians have deliberately attacked the electric system within Ukraine repeatedly. And, you know, at the same time, across the world, the various sources of energy and where do you buy your energy from has become an important subject. And the lack of resilience in the system, whether it be for current energy sources, such as LNG or anything else on the fossil side, or whether it be where do you get your lithium from and where do you process it and so on. You know, these are all challenges and they're all coming together, and at the very same time, and the video made it very clear, it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world, climate change is happening and it keeps on happening in the background and it's not slowing down whilst we try to deal with other things. So I think, you know, from the point of view of business, you know, those of us like ATCO who are a utility company to a large extent, you know, we want to make this energy transition. We want to see us doing the right things to fight climate change and to make that energy transition, but it's coming up against some very real barriers of, you know, what can you do in the timescale that we're looking at and that is economically and pragmatically possible. I mean, if I take Alberta as an example, and obviously, as you can tell from my accent, I'm a new Canadian. But if you take Alberta as an example for the Europeans in the audience, you can fit the whole of the United Kingdom inside Alberta and have room to spare, which means that when you're trying to, trying to generate and then move power, you know, around a province of that size, you've got some very real geographical challenges. And then you've got, well, where are you going to get that power from? And then, you know, if some of those things are fossil fuel, and, you know, it's very interesting, in Alberta, only 5 years ago, about 50% of the power generation was from coal. The coal will come to an end at the end of this year, well ahead of the schedule that we had agreed to. But we are still needing gas, LNG, to generate the power for home heating. You know, when you get into -30 temperatures for weeks at a time, renewables are fantastic, but they kind of stop working at that temperature and the wind stops blowing. And so you then have a real problem. So there are some real practical issues with energy transition. I take Alberta as an example because I'm familiar with it, but these problems are the same around the world. So I think we have a real problem to face that requires pragmatic dialogue between government, between business, because it's actually all intertwined. It's about energy that we all need, but it's also about security.
Well, and Mike, on that governance perspective, you have the up-close view of it, and governments are always trying to push forward a narrative to help move things, to invest, but as we're hearing it doesn't happen quickly, and there's a lot of challenges. You have had to find your way through such a difficult year here, and frankly, difficult years in Halifax and the surrounding area, both with security events and with climate change. What's your perspective on this?
Well, again, welcome everybody to Halifax. It's nice to have you here. feel free to extend your stay for a few days and spend some money while you're in Halifax. We have long had that intersection of security and climate, but never to the extent that we have now in Halifax. We had Hurricane Beth in 1971. We had Hurricane Juan, which was game changer for Halifax. That was in 2003. In the last 5 years, we've had 4 hurricanes and 3 tropical storms that have come and battered the eastern, because those storms that used to happen in the Gulf, in Mexico, and up through Florida, used to die out by the time they got to the Carolinas. They don't die out now because the water is warmer. So we've had those increasing number of weather activities in the fall. And then this year, as I mentioned the other night at the dinner, we had the largest, most significant fire in our history in the spring. We had the worst flooding in our history in the summer. We have become a 4-season disaster city. We felt this year like we were living the Old Testament, and people used to see each other in the street and say, "When are the locusts coming? When are the locusts coming?" It's been a challenge. But I would also, even at that point, I would say, it's not like when you have a drought in sub-Saharan Africa and hundreds of thousands of people are at risk of dying. We have the capacity to deal with it, but we're not going to have it forever if it continues. And on the security side, Halifax has always been an area that's been affected by conflict in other parts of the world. We've been very fortunate in that it really hasn't happened too much on our land, but we see it. In a couple of weeks, we will commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Halifax explosion, when 2 ships collided in Halifax Harbor, 1917, December the 6th. During World War I, they weren't directly involved in the conflict, but they were here because of the conflict. And on that day, 2,000 people died and 10,000 people were injured in a city of 60,000 people. One woman, who I often reference, a woman named Mary Eugenia Hinch Marr Jackson, woke up on the morning of December 6th in Halifax, saw her 10 kids off to school and her husband off to work. And when they found her the next day under the rubble, all 10 of her kids had died. Her husband had died. 3 of her 4 siblings had died, and her mother had died. And when they found her, she was pregnant. And she gave birth to Hubert in April of 1918, and she went on to marry again and have 3 more kids. I mention that because that's the resilience that comes from disasters, but you don't want to test it all the time, right? Halifax is the home of the largest number of military assets in Canada. We have the Air Force 12 Wing. We have the Mighty Maroons 5 Div in the Army. And we have the largest naval base in Canada. And that was reinforced recently, our role. Minister Blair announced the Diana Project, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. Nobody was more instrumental in that than Andy Fillmore, the Member of Parliament for Halifax, who pushed that, promoted that, and really activated that. So it's a very important part. The AOPS, the Atlantic Offshore Patrol Vehicles that are going to be, that are patrolling the north, were built here at the Irving Shipyard in Halifax. So the security and the changing climate really go hand in hand, and as it does with the energy as well. And I'll just say about climate, it is forcing all of us to change how we look at things. Halifax has a very good climate action plan. It's called Halifact, H-A-L-I-F-A-C-T, which is acting on climate together. And to fund it, we put a 3% tax on properties, over and above property tax, 3%. And I often tell people it was unanimously endorsed by some people. It is a contentious thing to do. And we need the federal government, we need Minister Blair, and we need the provincial government to support these things. But the world has changed, and I think countries like Canada and many of our allies have been fortunate in that we can sustain the early adjustments to that, the adaptation and the mitigation, but we're going to need a whole lot more in the years to come, and it will affect energy supply, and it will affect the relations that we have. And that opening video, the voiceover with the ice fields and the ice caps, that was kind of it's a shuddering thing, but there is a direct connection between the two.
There absolutely is, and I do want to open it up to the floor too, because I recognize we have an expert audience here, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So just while we're maybe getting the first folks who might like to ask a question, go ahead. And if I could just ask everyone to briefly introduce yourself so we know who you are.
I'm Lobsang Sangye. I'm regular at Halifax, thanks to Peter and in very good staff members and volunteers. I think, we talk about climate change. one particular issue I want to raise is water crisis, shortage of water. Again, the footage that you saw is the melting of glaciers or snow in Arctic. And Arctic and Antarctica is much being covered. But the third largest reserve of ice is in the Himalayas, is in Tibet. And by 2050, the population will be 10 billion in the world, right? And of which 5.3 billion will be in Asia. So more than half the population will be in Asia. Now, Asia is already facing water scarcity. China has a shortage of 40% of the population facing water scarcity. India, and as a whole. Now, Tibetan Plateau, the glaciers, right, is a source of 6 of the largest rivers of Asia and provides water to 1.4 billion people. So it's that important. Now, turning point is 2030. So the more glaciers will melt over Tibetan Plateau and less will be, covered. So that's the major crisis. So you just name it, China occupied Tibet. Primarily, one of the major reasons, there's lots of natural resources where Canadian companies are also investing, okay? Also, river. For example, Yellow River and Yangtze River, cradle of Chinese civilization. Origin is in Tibet. Brahmaputra, Mekong, Salween River, Irrawaddy River for Southeast Asia, and Indus River for Pakistan, and all originated in Tibet. So Asia is going to face major water crisis. Right? Now, in 2050, we will have 10 billion people. Right? Now, presently, we have 8 billion people. Food production is for 10 billion people, which is not enough because a lot is wasted. But in 2050, there will be 10 billion people, of which 50% will live in Asia, of which 60% are going to live in the city areas. Right? Again, they need water. So it's a major, major crisis. So I want, of course, as much as we're in Canada, Canada has surplus of water for 50 years. Okay? Asia is going to face major, major water crisis, and the Tibetan Plateau is very important. I would like you all to comment on that. Thank you.
Madeleine.
So I had the pleasure of actually going to an Arctic Circle event organized in Dubai last year and learning about the third pole and finding out that there's actually a lot of similarities in so much as, yes, the poles and the third pole are melting, but at the same time, interestingly enough, we are also dealing with, which is sort of counterintuitive, droughts. So just the same way that you have sort of fires and then the next thing is you have floods, these extremities are extremely difficult to deal with. So Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, is actually, I think, on its 6th year of a water emergency because we don't have enough water for our community. And we actually can't develop because of it. So we need to recognize that we are in such extreme changes and managing it is extremely difficult, which means that we have to plan for it and we have to figure out, almost where we're at and where we're going to be and make the appropriate investments as a result.
I mean, I'd make a brief comment on it, which is not really an answer to your question, but more a sort of expansion of the worry, really, which is that I think water has tended to be seen as a local issue, and it isn't, as you very well described. It's a strategic issue. And what worries me is not only in Tibet and Southeast Asia, as you described, but in Middle East, North Africa as well. I think there is this very great risk that water will be weaponized. And that whoever holds the top of the river will control what goes down the river. And I think we have not perhaps grappled with that or seen it in the significance that it actually has.
Could I just very briefly say, so thank you for the question. Canada has 50 years supply of fresh water. When I became mayor, they told me we had 50 years supply of housing in Halifax, and we don't anymore. So sometimes those things can change. And we do have areas within the Halifax region. So people come here for the security forum. Maybe you don't realize that Halifax is the largest rural municipality in Atlantic Canada. We're 5,500 square kilometers. We're very large. And we've had areas where we've had droughts as well. What I think about relative to your question is my old buddy Bob Ray, who was in politics and is now Canada's commissioner to the UN, used to say about the economy. He used to say, the animals all get along very well until the water supply starts going down at the water hole. And I think it's the same with water. We can't look at this just as a local situation, but we have to make sure. The old saying of think globally, act locally, we have to make sure that we take a wider view of this across the world, not allow it to become weaponized. Certainly we're fortunate in Canada, but there's no guarantee that will always be the case.
And maybe I could just also add is because I remember with the mayor of Yellowknife and the mayor of Whitehorse, is that their primary energy source is actually dams. And that, of course, is water. And to find out that with a reduction of the precipitation is that they've actually had to build diesel power plant backups. So water is more than just simply the consumption of water, what we need to drink, and of course for agricultural purposes and to cook with. It is also in many places of the world our energy source. And if we're going to achieve some of our energy, I guess, outcomes or targets, water is actually also a critical component of that consideration.
One of the things I love about the Halifax Forum is learning things like that. I mean, it's such an important geography lesson that we don't think about often, and the complications of it, and these themes that are starting to emerge, that thin membrane between the situation we have now, where we have the resources we need, and when it becomes a massive fight for them. The acceleration with which we have to deal with this, but the inability to really know exactly what our bridging is, other than things like diesel and fossil fuels in the meantime. I know we have another question over here, so please go ahead.
Good morning. Maxine Laws, New Zealand. All three of you talked about resilience and infrastructure. Every time you have a fire or a flood, your infrastructure gets damaged in some way. So what are you doing to future-proof the impacts of climate change? And are you using technology and engaging with industry to look at how you can do things differently to ensure not only are you resilient, but your infrastructure survives each fire, each flood? Thank you.
Great question. Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go to that. Look, I could talk about that all day, and I understand we're only going until 4, so I'll have to my answer a little bit. Look, I was at a conference in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago called Climate Proof Canada, and we talked a lot about this. The infrastructure piece is really important because when we lose infrastructure, quite often that infrastructure gave way to climate, so we can't just replace what we already have. We have to make it better. We have to make it stronger. We have to make it more resilient. And I will speak as cities, and I'll be, 2 weeks from today, I'll be in COP in Dubai, meeting with other mayors from around the world. We will be talking about this issue worldwide, which is how do we get the infrastructure right? And we're all burdened with legacy infrastructure that we know is not going to withstand. The stuff we have now is not going to withstand a lot of the climate changes that we have that are coming at us. I mean, Bill toured the areas that we had floods and fires this summer and saw what it was. So this is a major, major cost, and it's not something, in Canada, 60% of infrastructure is managed by cities, and we collect less than 10% of the taxes. It's a tough formula. I say that for you and your colleagues, Bill, because I know you get it. I know you get it, being a former police chief. But so yes, the infrastructure, it's not just building back what we have, and that's why it's both mitigation and adaptation that we have to make sure. We can't, in Halifax, we don't allow people to build near water because of obvious reasons. We want to maintain nature-based solutions. You know, the average silver maple tree can absorb 200 liters of water an hour. What does that mean? That means it's resilient. So we're putting nature to use, and we think that we can achieve 30% of our climate targets through nature, through trees and the protection of waterways and biodiversity and those things. So the infrastructure is going to change. It has to be better than it was in the past because what's happened in the past is failing us.
I'm going to go to Madeleine too and Jim, but would it be possible to give a mic as well to the minister? Because I do want to get his perspective as the former Minister for Emergency Preparedness on that, since we touched on it. Madeleine, up in the Arctic, I mean, you were talking about the permafrost giving way, the pipes breaking. You're actively seeing the climate that this infrastructure was built for change. How do you even predict what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years?
So there's a couple of things. One is that I think we have the benefit of seeing what our Arctic neighbors are doing. And truth be told, they're being way more innovative in the development of technologies to address climate change. So, you know, I look to Greenland that actually builds on solid bedrock instead of trying to bury the pipes in what used to be, you know, solid ground and is now constantly in flux. You know, there is a lot of innovation that could and should be done. I remember advocating, unfortunately not successfully, that we should have sensors on our pipes so that we actually know what's happening. All domain awareness to me is, yeah, absolutely. We should know what's happening in an environment, including climatically. In the Arctic, we have virtually very little to no information about the marine environment. This is why I'm advocating very strongly not only to build out a subsea telecommunications cable, but that sections of it should be a smart cable, and that is effectively sensors on that cable so that you're able to get, baseline data on what is the temperature and the pressure and the salinity and the currents, but also being able to distinguish between whales and submarines, or unmanned vehicles in our marine environment, because you can't actually work, without information. So infrastructure, investments and developing technologies for our Arctic environment can be both good for, as I said, the climate, knowing what's happening, because that's anytime there's a military response, one of the things that people on the ground are trying, okay, well, what weather are we even dealing with? Can we fly in? How much, equipment is required and what type of equipment? Because it is a unique environment. So having that information is absolutely critical as part of the response.
And can I just say on that, the Ocean Frontier Institute here in Halifax is doing a lot of that work and is working in the north as well. So I want to put a plug in. They'll be active at COP again. But those are really, really important points. Like, we don't know enough about what we don't know, particularly when it comes to the oceans.
And to the point about what we don't know, I know particularly in Canada, it's a sovereignty and security issue in the north where there's a lot of interest and not a lot of military capacity to surveil and detect things at the level that I suspect several people in this room would like to be able to. Yes, I promise you I will go back to there afterwards. Minister, I just wanted to give you a chance to jump in because you were the Minister for Emergency Preparedness on dealing with that future-proofing of infrastructure.
A couple of things, if I may. One of the resources that we call upon frequently in Canada, when any community gets in trouble, when people need to be evacuated, when fires have to be fought, when we have to sandbag our communities, we call upon the Canadian military, and frankly, we put a lot of stress on them because they've got a lot of other really important jobs to do, and they've got to be trained and equipped to do it. I think one of the challenges we face, Mike, is I believe there's close to $1 trillion infrastructure deficit in this country. What we've got is aging out. What we've got is not fit for purpose. The new climate reality is going to challenge our communities, and I think in many cases we've built, out of perhaps ignorance or even just ambition, but we've built in places we probably shouldn't have built. 100%. We put our communities and hard decisions are going to be made. And I think the last thing, and I want to tie climate change back a little bit to the security question. It is on the issue even of water. We are going to see, with increased rising temperatures, drought conditions, we're going to see climate refugees and migrations across this country that can put enormous pressure on our security systems. And quite frankly, we are not yet prepared for it. But there is a growing acknowledgement and knowledge of the challenges we face. And to Mike's last point, all three orders of government and civil society and the private sector all have to step up to the plate on this. There is no one order of government. For a long time, we left it with municipalities, and that was unfair and obviously didn't get the job done. And so I think that's going to require a real commitment, a greater coordination, and a lot of leadership. Thanks.
Right. I know there was a question back there. Yes, go ahead, please.
Good morning. I made my best efforts to be seen, and thank you for giving me the chance. My name is Sabrina Sakeb. I'm an Afghan Canadian. Minister Blair has mentioned something about refugees, and I wanted also to bring this up. Considering the importance of human resources and the challenges of immigration, Canada has hosted 40,000 Afghans who are living here through the evacuation process, which we are really and dearly thankful for that. And I know that hundreds of them are settled down here in Halifax. I wanted to know what is the city's, Halifax city's programs to make sure that these immigrants resettle properly, integrate into the society, and what are your specific programs besides learning English and making a new life here, a qualified and quality life here in Canada, not to be a burden on the shoulders of the societies, rather to be resources, to be helpful. So that's my question to the Honourable Mayor of Halifax. Thank you.
Well, who wants to go first?
I'll go first and say one of those 40,000 is one of my former interpreters from Afghanistan. I'm really glad that Canada got him out before Kabul.
Thank you for that.
There you go.
Thank you very much. You know what? When I became the mayor of Halifax, and it seems like a long time ago now, one of the first things we set up was the local immigration partnership, because I fundamentally believe that the growth of our city is going to be spurred by immigration, and it has been. Last few years, it's also been spurred by interprovincial growth from other parts of the country because of the way that the province and the region managed, I think, COVID. So the first big test for us was what people often don't know, this room would know. Most people don't know that there are refugees all over the world that we don't even see in Canada, because Canada is a hard country to walk to from Africa. You don't just get here easily. And so I'm proud of the fact that we welcome refugees. I tingled with pride when the Prime Minister went out on the tarmac to welcome Syrian refugees to this country. I thought that said a lot about us. In Halifax, we welcomed over 1,200 Syrian refugees in 2016. And we said, what are we going to do? We're not just going to bring them in. I fundamentally believe that in the years to come, those folks are going to be fine. The people who come to Canada, certainly those who come to Nova Scotia, are more entrepreneurial than the people that are born here. They will find their way very well, whether they come with money or whether they just come with a desire for a better life. But what did we do specifically? We were very proud of the fact we had a Welcome to Halifax program where we provided free transit and free recreation services to all refugees for the first 2 years that they were here, which was very helpful to them. And by the way, they're the people who are the most complimentary toward our transit system, and the people who've, so we appreciate that. But the other area that refugees love in this city, and I think in all cities, is the library system. You know, one of the great things about, I'm proud that Halifax, hope some of you have seen our new central, it's not that new anymore, but one of the top 10 new buildings in the world in 2015, according to CNN. Beautiful central library. But you know, the great thing about a library is, you know, that card doesn't cost you anything. And so it is where people gather. We have Dr. Ahmed Hussein over here, who is very involved with people, I'm sure, that are coming from around the world. The library system is a huge welcome to people. So yeah, we've set up a connector program to try to connect new Canadians to Canadians who are already here. And we have to recognize the unique circumstance. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Belfast. I was born in the UK. I came here at 7 years old. I'm an immigrant officially, but I look like every other kid, except that I was cuter and better spoken. But I look like every other kid. It's not the same as somebody who came from Syria as one of 9 kids, 3 of whom were in a wheelchair, who have no money, and whose father, who I love, when we asked him his profession to try to get him work, his profession was he was a poet. I said, geez, I don't see a lot of ads for poets right now, but we were able to, but they'll work. So yeah, I think you have to recognize that immigrants build Canada, and immigrants, by the way, are not the reason for our housing crisis. They are a victim of the housing crisis. They may well be the solution to our housing crisis. So we all have to work together, and I think I'm very proud. Halifax has been very good, I think, at welcoming the new Canadians and the special efforts that we've made. Thank you for the question. I'm done. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, we have a question right there, please.
Thank you. Ayman Mhanna from the Samir Kassir Foundation in Lebanon. Going back to climate, my fear is there are a lot of very good principles and objectives, and at the same time, contradictions and difficult policy decisions. Nuclear is one of them, especially in societies that are divided, that do not necessarily have the right levels of good governance and oversight. So, expansion of nuclear, where? The Nile crisis between Egypt and Ethiopia, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people with high risks of migration, of displacement, and we all know the grave yard that the Mediterranean has become between, the southern shore and its northern shore. So will we focus on banning migrants from going to Europe because of crises in Africa? or will we help Ethiopia and Egypt solve their crisis? Dubai, Qatar have all organized COP. Is it greenwashing? Is it real commitment? And should we turn a blind eye on some greenwashing that is happening while also supporting some positive initiatives? These are difficult decisions to make on a daily basis when you're in, your governments. So, is there a way to find a balance between principles and actual good policies? Thank you.
I'd like to put that to you first, Jim, because I mean, that's one of the things you have to think about all the time is dealing with the short term, the energy crisis, the needs, and that long-term transition. And sometimes the workable solution is not necessarily the ideal solution.
I mean, you've made some really good points, both on water and on energy itself. The trouble with energy is that it's such long-term investment required, and for long-term investment, you need certainty. Or a degree of certainty at least. And I think, a lot of these things, some energy, as you mentioned, nuclear has had this aura of we can't talk about that and we can't have that here and so on and so forth. But I think we need to have a broader, more open-minded conversation about all energy sources, whether it be the use of carbon capture on some of our existing sources, whether it be more and more renewables, but we need something which provides the base load when the renewables don't work, or you need an awful lot of storage, and then storage takes you into all those supply chain problems and lithium and cobalt and everything else. There are other sources that, and I think there was this question on innovation earlier. There's a lot going on in the world of hydrogen. We in ATCO are doing a lot of experimentation and blending it with natural gas and using it for transportation power and so on, and we're doing it in Australia as well. And that looks very promising, but it's not going to be a whole solution. So we're going to need this blend of different solutions, and I personally feel that nothing should be off the table. Coming back to defence and security, and what Madeleine was talking about earlier, the reality is that in the north of this country, the vast majority of power generation is by diesel, and diesel creates black soot. Black soot goes on the snow, and you get into a nasty circle. And so we've got to get off of it. But equally, when you've got 50% of the year and there's no sunshine, solar's not the answer. If the wind doesn't work because of ice buildup or whatever, that's not the answer. So small modular reactors perhaps have got to be part of the answer. Some of the defence and security issues, we were talking about North Warning System and NORAD modernisation yesterday. Some of the requirements of the technologies that are coming in are huge energy use. Well, we can't physically move the amount of diesel you'd need to do that by diesel. So we've got to find another way. I think certainly the conversations I have with people perhaps are becoming more open-minded about nuclear. I hope so. The difficulty with nuclear always is if you put it into an unstable region, people worry about what happens if it gets into the wrong hands and gets used for something else. Not to mention, of course, what do you do with nuclear waste and whose responsibility is it and so on. I think, these are really difficult areas. I think there needs to be ongoing discussion, government to government, but also business to business, about what are the practical solutions, what are the policy solutions, and how do you do it. Lastly, your point, and it comes back, a minute ago I was thinking, is immigration really relevant to this, a climate change discussion? But of course it absolutely is, in the way you talked about, which is that climate change and the effects of it in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, is causing people to move. Perhaps I don't believe anyone's ever entirely a refugee or a migrant for one sole reason. There's usually a number of reasons that are all coming together. And so I think, we are seeing mass movement into Europe. There will come a point when it's going to get really difficult for Europe. So your point is valid. Try and fix the problems at source instead.
So maybe I'll add to that. I actually sit on a national advisory council made up of Indigenous peoples on SMRs, because we recognize that we need to get approximately 300 rural, remote Indigenous communities in Canada off of diesel. And we're not going to meet our 2050 net zero targets without nuclear. But what I can say is there's a big distinction sort of scientifically and physics regarding SMRs or micro modular reactors compared to the really large concrete water-cooled nuclear power plants. So we are having those conversations now, and I have to thank NRCan for actually supporting those conversations. But we need to be able to provide our communities all the information on all the different energy solutions so that they can have informed conversations and make informed decisions. Because we also know at that Indigenous Advisory Council is that not a single SMR or MMR is going to happen in this country without Indigenous participation. Consultation, looking at our equity involvement, the era of building transmission lines and damming large swaths of our land with no benefits to our people and actually bearing all the risks is no longer acceptable. But what I can say, Jim, is that from what at least I have learned, is that most of the way that the SMRs are being developed, that power source actually cannot be weaponized and is incredibly safe. And so what would happen in the worst case scenarios when it doesn't work anymore is that there is no explosion, there's no meltdown, it just powers down. So, but maybe what I do want to just add is that we are a country that while we have these big laudable targets of net zero by 2050, we have no energy strategy. And I think that's a big problem. Not knowing how we're going to roll it out and meet these targets. So what I can say is that thankfully most of the provincial and some of the territorial sort of power corporations are trying to figure that out, but we do need to do a better job of it because it is often these energy solutions are going to actually be not more than in one province. They're going to actually be networks of solutions, and that means we need to ensure that they're interconnected. And that one solution that works in Alberta may or may not be applicable in Nunavut. We don't know yet, but we need to have those conversations. And they're starting, but I think that we need to accelerate them.
Could I speak to the greenwashing? Because it was a good point that was brought up.
Absolutely.
So I go to COP. I've been to the last two in Glasgow and in Sharm, and this year I'll go on behalf of FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Big City Mayors Caucus. And so we have this discussion because I hear it from lots of people that people are concerned that we're, these rich places. I mean, Sharm el-Sheikh, I don't know how many of you have been there. It's a very, fancy place, Dubai, obviously. And, all these people from developed countries flying in big planes and private planes into Dubai to talk about saving on climate, on greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, it's a challenge. For us, it is an opportunity to meet with other people around the world who share our concern that climate has to be addressed more seriously. The Paris Climate Accords came out of a COP meeting. On balance, there's no question that there is, and the same with corporate. There are corporations that are accused of greenwashing what they do, but initiatives that are good are initiatives that are good. So is there some hypocrisy to it? There probably is, but I don't know, if you took all the hypocrisy out of politics, all you'd have is a bunch of loud socks and bad hair. So, we do our best.
No comment as a political reporter on that. Let's take a question from this side of the room, please.
Thank you so much, Solange Marquez from Mexico. Thank you for talking about the greenwashing. My question is about migration. We are seeing big waves of migrants through South America to United States. And it is, of course, a security issue, but it is also motivated because of climate change. And there is no discussion about this in different forums. I have been in different forums, and we are discussing how they are impacting the economy in the United States, the politics, of course, the elections, but we are not discussing what's the cause, and it is mostly motivated because of climate change. We had a Hurricane 5, Category 5 in Mexico last month. It almost destroyed Acapulco. And I think it was 5 years ago, Al Gore was in Mexico, and he talked about that touristic places in Mexico will be in danger. And we have to start preparing for that. We didn't prepare and now we are facing the consequences. So I understand what you say. Yeah, greenwashing is there, and COP28 is not going to fulfill. I think it's failed right now because they are not they don't want to discuss the big issues and put higher standards. So how we face that? How in the South, that we are not included in some of the discussions, how we face that and how we push for something to happen in a fastest mode. So thank you for your answers.
I'm looking at the politician on the panel.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, certainly your point is well taken. And the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a lot of focus on this just transition and supporting countries that can't afford to do the transition that they need to do. And as I said earlier, as a developed country in Canada, this is a huge hit on our, as a city, this is going to cost us 5 to 10% of our budget this year just to retrofit, getting people streets that take them out of communities that, to Bill's point, probably were poorly designed in the first place. But we will sustain that in the short term. And as is the case with every crisis that we have, those who have the least are hit the hardest. It's always that way. And on climate, it's more so than ever. It is those people who have very little resources to deal with the impacts of climate who have to deal with it. So one of the things we can do, there will be climate migrants coming here. And you know, migrancy is based on crisis. In Canada, we opened up for the Syrian crisis, for the Afghan crisis. We have many Ukrainians who are here, perhaps temporarily. And by the way, I haven't mentioned Ukraine very much. Slava Ukraini. I look forward when I leave here. Andy, is that still outside? The protest? I think there was supposed to be a gathering outside in support of Ukraine. But yeah, we have to, as developed, we have to work with people who have less, and we have to forgive debt to countries that we owe money to, so they can afford to then capitalize their efforts on climate. That's just a fact. It's not going to get any easier. It's going to get a lot worse.
Just to pick up your point about resilience and infrastructure and so on, you know, and I think there is no doubt that there have been more hurricanes and more damage, not only in Mexico, but in the Caribbean, in the southern states of the US. And, you know, we as ATCO have been involved in rebuilding the electricity infrastructure in Puerto Rico. And some of what we have been doing there is a Build Back Better system. You know, it is possible when you are replacing infrastructure, whether it's after wildfires, whether it's after hurricanes or whatever it is, to build it back better. And there was a question earlier on about sort of technology and innovation and what we're doing in that space. We are doing an awful lot of work on trying to detect things and prevent them, but, you know, so that, you know, some of the problems that have been caused, I think we had wildfires in California, which, you know, one of the electricity companies came, you know, under fire there for being the cause of the event. So you've got to do better vegetation management, you've got to do better monitoring of it, you've got to build better infrastructure, and I think utility companies around the world are doing better on that. They are learning from each of these events. I think one other point I'd make, though, is to do with resilience and imagination. And we saw events this year, I'm thinking of the wildfires in the Northwest Territories of Canada around Yellowknife and so on, where, you know, sometimes, you know, resilience planning is not carried through to the degree that it needs to be because of a failure of imagination. I think the vast majority of people who lived in Yellowknife, including those in government, couldn't really imagine that they'd ever have to evacuate a city of that size. And so they didn't really do a lot of planning for it. And I think we've got to get better at that. We've got to get to the point where we can imagine what apparently is unimaginable and plan for it, because we owe it to, you know, ourselves to do this and not to be doing things as a last-minute crisis. And as the Minister said earlier, very often it's the Canadian Armed Forces that have to step in to that last-minute crisis. And that is not a good thing for the use of the armed forces, really. They can do it, but it's not what they're designed for. And I think other countries have done some thinking about this, about what you need to stand up in terms of capability and what you can do with the private sector, perhaps, certainly in detection of wildfires and so on, before it gets to a massive size, and deal with things much sooner. And I think we have to start taking those steps. And if we don't do it, we're going to press the button marked Armed Forces Emergency one day, and there's not going to be enough of them there to do it. Or they're going to be busy doing something else that we actually want them to do. So I think we all need to do a better job of resilience. Last point on this, one of the things that my part of ATCO does is we do an awful lot of work with First Nations on resilience capacity building in Alberta and Saskatchewan and BC, and they sometimes get left behind in all of this preparedness training by municipalities, by provinces, and they are the responsibility of the federal government, who don't actually have the ability to do much for them. And we've been doing a lot of work with that, funded by the federal government, and it is making a difference in terms of people being ready to cope when these events come, because we can't stop hurricanes happening. What we can do is be better prepared for them and build back better after them.
We are literally out of time, but I have two very quick thoughts I was hoping you could share before we go, because I think they're important to tie the themes in the panel. Madeleine, I wanted to ask you for a quick overview of what the security situation is, particularly with Russia, to tie this back to Ukraine and the Arctic right now. And then, Jim, your view on how that has changed the dynamics with energy demand and what people are willing to accept. I mean, when you have the Green Party of Germany saying fracking is okay, it seems like a pretty drastic paradigm shift. Madeleine, if you want to go first.
That's a really big question.
I feel like I left it right to the end.
Well, first of all, I thankfully wrote something that got published, so it gives you a bit of a sense of, why and how Arctic security is at the forefront now of many of our Arctic nations because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the need to not only have NORAD modernized so that we understand, as has been said and articulated, exceptionally well these last couple days, is that we need to invest, and we need to be aware, we need to deter, and we need to ensure that our Arctic peoples and our Indigenous peoples are also part of that endeavor and solution, so that we're not left behind and continue to see, our region not be prosperous. So I think I'm trying to figure out how to succinctly, tie the bow onto that question, which is, we've got to recognize not only as an Arctic nation, but as an ally in NORAD and with NATO, that we need to do a lot more work in understanding the risks and the threats, and begin to prepare and plan and invest in what is required to bring a safe, secure, not only sort of nation, but also our Arctic part of the nation.
Thank you, Madeleine. Jim?
All of what Madeleine said. I think when I was at Sandhurst, the Berlin Wall fell down, and I thought, oh gosh, what have I done joining the army? I've got nothing to do now. The Russian threat is back in a big way, and we need no more evidence than what we've seen in Ukraine, although there is plenty more. NORAD modernization needs to happen. NORAD modernization needs to go further than we've said right now. A lot of what has been committed to it is good, but it's not enough. The gap between where we need to be and where we are is too big, and the Russians are not going to wait for us to catch up. So I think that is really important. Madeleine's point on Indigenous participation is absolutely true. I sit on the board of a joint corporation with Indigenous Inuit Development Corporation partners. They are the majority owners. They operate and maintain the North Warning System. There is the capacity in the north to do these things that is difficult, that is technically advanced. It is absolutely there. And so I think, they need to be very much a part of all of that. And we need to keep finding a way to do all of this whilst taking the challenges of climate change seriously. And, things like that can be done. Small modular reactors, as we talked about, if you put one into the north in order to power some of the NORAD modernization requirements, well, guess what? You could provide free energy to a local community for life. That's pretty convincing, I would say. So I think there is things that need to be done. but the Russian threat is absolutely there, and Ukraine has to win, and that's it.
Yeah, I think you find a lot of agreement in this room, and certainly a need to shore up not only on climate change and our ability to deal with it, but security and energy for Ukraine in the short term, and trying to balance priorities that I think we hadn't thought a lot about balancing before the last couple of years. Thank you so much to our panel and for our room for the great discussion. Please stay in your seats for now. It's applaud, definitely.